Good evening from Vancouver. My name is Birgit Densch and I'm the Deputy Consul General at the German Consulate General in Vancouver, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Artists Roundtable on Graphic, Autobiography and the Holocaust, featuring Nora Krug, Leela, Corman and Miriam, Katin. This is the second event of our virtual event series with Nora Krug, which we present proudly in cooperation with our partners, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center in Vancouver, the University of British Columbia and the University of Victoria. We are happy that we were not forced to give up completely our original plans to hold face-to-face events with Nora Krug in Victoria and Vancouver due to the pandemic. We only had to alter our plans because Nora agreed without hesitation to our going virtual with these three events around her award-winning family album, Belonging, Heimat, a German reckons with history and home. Remembering for the future is one of the topics we are committed to address during the 12 months German chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which counts today 34 member states, including Canada and the United States of America. The works of Nora, Leela, and Miriam perfectly match this theme. Today, people in the midst of our society question the Holocaust, trivialize and falsify history. They are looking for the answers to today's challenges in nationalism, in isolation from strangers, and stir up anti-Semitism and racism. Anti-Semitism is a sign of profound anti-democratic ideology. The fight against anti-Semitism is about defending basic values and social solidarity and is a top priority of the German government. Very soon, no survivors of the Holocaust and World War II will be able to tell us their story. It is up to all of us to keep their memories alive, to have them guide us to act right now and today, and to counter historical ignorance to ensure that the horrors of the past must not take place again. This is what Nora Krug, Leela, Corman and Miriam Katin are doing with their graphic novels in an exemplary manner, and we are honored that they are with us tonight. Before the conversation between these three great women starts, a few technical notes. As you have probably already noted, your microphones are muted and the video function is activated for our moderators and panelists only. The chat function has been disabled. The panelists do welcome your questions, which you can submit via the Q&A function only. You find it on the bottom or on the top of your Zoom window. They will endeavor to respond to as many questions as possible. As noted in your registration confirmation, today's program will be recorded and you will receive later or probably tomorrow an email with information where to find the recordings also from yesterday's event and today's. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our two moderators for tonight, Professor Charlotte Chalier and Dr. Biz Neidem, who are both specialists on German comics and graphic novels, recently co-edited a special issue of the Canadian German Studies Journal seminar on German comics and social justice, and have both played a major role in the realization of today's event. Charlotte Chalier is Professor of Germanic Studies in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Victoria. Her research interest includes post-1945 diasporic and transcultural writing filmmaking, memory studies, Jewish identity and contemporary cultural discourse, and teaching, learning about the Holocaust. Charlotte Chalier is also the project lead of narrative art and visual storytelling in Holocaust and human rights education, a research initiative that brings together graphic novelists and Holocaust survivors in Canada, Germany, Israel, the Netherlands, and the UK. Dr. Biz Neidem is visiting assistant professor in German studies in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She also sits on the executive boards for the International Comic Arts Forum and Comic Studies Society. Her research examines the content Aesthetics and Political Engagement of Comics and Graphic Novels, Digital Games, and New Media. In particular, her current book project investigates the role of comics and graphic novels in East German memory culture, drawing connections between comics and museum practices and exhibition strategies. And now, without further ado, I wish you a particularly interesting and delightful evening with Nora Krug, Leela, Corman, and Miriam, Katin, and welcome Biz and Charlotte, who will introduce our three guests. Enjoy.
Thank you, Birgit, for that excellent introduction. Charlotte and I are thrilled to be participating in this event and would like to express our gratitude to our co-organizers, especially the German Consulate General in Vancouver and the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. Before we get started this evening, I would like to first introduce the three artists featured in tonight's roundtable, after which I will hand it over to the guests themselves, who will briefly present their work. Then we will open it up to a larger conversation between our featured guests, which Charlotte and I will moderate. So Nora Krug is a German-American author and illustrator and an associate professor of illustration at Parsons School of Design in New York City. Her graphic novel, Belonging, A German Reckons with History and Home, which is the focus of this series of virtual events, won the 2018 National Book Critics Circle Award in Autobiography, the 2019 Schubart-Literaturpreis, and the 2019 Evangelischer Buchpreis. Through the artful combination of text, illustration, photography, documents, and objects, Belonging recounts Krug's research and archival work in uncovering her family's National Socialist history. Then Leela Corman is an American cartoonist and illustrator of Polish Jewish descent, a native New Yorker, ex-belly dancer, and occasional front person of noisy art rock bands. In 2012, Corman published the graphic novel Untitled, book one of her NYC trilogy, which follows the lives of Jewish twin sisters growing up in the tenements of New York City's Lower East Side at the turn of the last century. Untitled was nominated for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, an Eisner Award, and the Prix Artemisia, and won the Le Prix Mille Pages and the Romix Prize. Tonight, however, I hope she will also speak to her current book project, Victory Parade, book two of the trilogy, in a work of fiction set in the worlds of the living and the dead, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the wrestling ring, and the Allied liberation of Buchenwald. Lastly, Miriam Katin is an American award-winning graphic novelist and graphic artist who was born in 1942 in wartime Budapest. While her father served in the Hungarian army, she and her mother escaped to the Nazi occupation of Hungary by faking their own deaths and acquiring false identification documents. After having worked as an artist all of her life, Katin started creating comics in the early 2000s. Inspired by Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, she began work on her first graphic novel about her and her mother's experience during World War II, which was published under the title We Are on Our Own in 2006. Her second graphic novel, Letting It Go from 2013, is also autobiographical and features an intellectual and graphic engagement with what it means to come to terms with the past from a very personal perspective. So without further ado, I'll let our guests take it from here. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm Nora Krug, and I'm very excited to be here tonight along with the other artists and panelists. I'm going to share my screen because I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Belonging. I hope you can see it in a moment. And if you don't, I hope somebody will let me know. Full screen. Okay. So Belonging is a 280-page, fully illustrated and hand-lettered, the English edition is hand-lettered, visual memoir about World War II and my German family history. This is the American title page, and this is the German one. The foreign edition title is called Heimat. Before working on this book, I had created a series of visual short biographies about the lives of people who've experienced war firsthand. And in doing so, it was important for me to focus on the lives of people who are more or less unknown, because they came out of the wars neither as heroes nor as villains, because I was very interested in what war does to those who move in the gray zones of war, whose lives are perceived neither inspiring nor deterring enough to be reported on, and whose guilt or innocence is difficult to prove or measure. I was interested in finding out what war does to these people. Researching these people's lives and illustrating their stories allowed me to gain a more tangible understanding of what it's like to experience war. It was only after I had worked on this series of short visual narratives for about 10 years that I realized that all this time I had been subconsciously avoiding to tell the story of war from a German point of view. Because as somebody representing the country of the perpetrators, I felt that I had no right to tell it. The atrocities my country committed during the Second World War cast a long shadow all throughout my childhood growing up in Germany. And my years as a teenager were accompanied by a tremendous sense of inherited guilt. But even though we continuously learned about the Holocaust in school, even though we regularly went on field trips to concentration camp museums, spoke to survivors, analyzed Adolf Hitler's speeches word by word. This is an excerpt from my actual exercise book as a student, where I analyzed one of his speeches on the left-hand side. Even though we did all this research, we grew, the guilt we grew into remained abstract, and conversations about what happened in our own families and in our own towns were non-existent. By the time I learned about the Holocaust in school, around the age of 12 or 13, all my grandparents had died, and I had missed my chance to ask them directly about their lives under the Nazi regime. My parents, both of whom were born in 1946, so about a year after the war ended, knew equally little about their own parents' involvement in the war because the subject had never actually been discussed at home. And my guilt and the gaping hole that was my family's history left me with a feeling of emotional paralysis that also went in tandem with a feeling of cultural disorientation as a German of my generation. And because my cultural identity was so deeply entangled with my country's past, I grew up rejecting any notion of a German tradition, leaving me not to take pride in any of my country's cultural achievements that existed long before the Nazis came to power. My friends and I, for instance, never learned old folk songs, and we struck the words for hero and pride from our vocabularies. We never learned the lyrics to our national anthem. During the 21 years of my living abroad, I was often confronted with negative stereotypes about my home country, and I've often been aware that my accent alone can evoke the memory of the Nazis' crime. And as a German in a foreign land, I've been living in the US for about 17 years, and I lived in England for 3 years prior to that. I felt more German than ever before. And I felt a growing urge to go back and confront my own family's history in a new way and to ask those questions that I never had a chance to ask before. My book Belonging follows my search for my family history and their wartime stories, and concurrent to that, my search for what it means to be German to me today. Through a combination of short comics, full-page illustrations, and photographs, as well as archival materials that are integrated into the book charts my search for my own family, and connected to that search, my quest for German identity. The book follows my journey as I seek out lost relatives in the village where my father grew up, and track down old family homes, and consult local archives for the smallest bit of information and the tiniest scrap of paper I could find about my family's life under the Nazi regime. The particular focus of my narrative is my maternal grandfather named Willi, featured on the left page, who was a driving teacher in my hometown, Karlsruhe, in the southwest of Germany during the war, and my paternal uncle, called Franz Karl, who died as an SS soldier in Italy at age 19. He was drafted into the army at 18 and died at age 19. Their stories are intertwined throughout the book. And interwoven into the family narrative are pages that are entitled From the Scrapbook of a Memory Archivist, which feature objects, letters, and old photographs from the 1930s and 40s that I found at flea markets across Germany over the years of my search. Things that provide the tangible and evidential experience of war that my own grandparents and uncle weren't able to provide me with. These pages are arranged thematically throughout the narrative. Similarly, the book contains encyclopedic pages called From the Notebook of a Homesick Emigre, Things German, which feature and catalog objects and activities and places which to me are deeply rooted in the German consciousness, aspects of my culture that were often misappropriated by the Nazis and whose emotional meaning I only became aware of during my working on the book while living away from Germany and looking at it from a distance. To me, my book Belonging is not a book that seeks to provide specific answers, but it was more for me an attempt of raising more complex questions about the German war experience and also for my particular family to try to figure out how my family how the memory of the Second World War and how it has impacted us has evolved over generations through time. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let the next speaker present.
Hi. First, I just want to say that was amazing, Nora, and I'm absolutely stunned that one of the things you had to do in school was to analyze Hitler's speeches, and I want to ask you about that later. That's really amazing. Well, okay, so thank you so much, everybody, for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I want to share my screen as well, so I'm gonna see, hopefully this will work. I haven't really done it this way through Zoom on this device before, but so let me know if you have trouble seeing this. Now all I can see, hold on.
It looks good on my end, at least.
Okay, good. So I can't actually see what I'm sharing with you. I can only see a black screen. So I'm currently working on a book that is set during the Second World War called Victory Parade, and that's what you're looking at right now. A couple of pages from that. This is both the opening page and it comes later. Perhaps I should explain what this book is before I throw you into a scene where a character is either dead or dreaming that she's in a Busby Berkeley movie. So I'm trying to get back to zoom out of here. Okay. So this book is set partially in Brooklyn during the Second World War, in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where women were working and building ships and munitions. And it's partially set at the Allied liberation of Buchenwald. So I'm going to show you a couple of pages from each of that. But this very quickly became, in the same way that Untersachen quickly became a story about a vaudeville performer, when I thought it was going to be a story about an abortion provider, this book is becoming a story about a wrestler who's actually a refugee from Germany. I haven't actually started turning the pages yet. So I wanted to speak a little bit before I throw you guys into this, but you know what? Heck, let's do it. So a lot of Victory Parade takes place in the space where the worlds of the living and the dead intersect. I'm very interested in what is going on in that space, in places where people are very agitated, where there's a lot of trauma. And so I have this image in my head of places like battlefields and prison camps being places where there's a lot of astral agitation. What's happening in this scene is that, well, you know what? I'm not going to give it away, but this is the wrestler character, and something's going on. So here, we'll go back to a slightly happier moment where she's not dreaming, she's awake, and she's trash talking in the ring. I have a background in martial arts and dance, so I like drawing people in motion a lot. I'm just going to kind of go through these rather quickly because it's difficult for me to talk and show these at the same time. And the things I'm showing are from a few different projects. So this is from a work in progress. I'm going to skip that one and come back to it, in fact. I'll stay with Victory Parade pages. So in thinking about the liberation of Buchenwald, I started to think about, well, who are the people who liberated concentration camps? What happened to them? And as I started to do the research about them, what became very evident was that, number one, most of them never talked about their experience. And number two, they were very traumatized by it. Now, I grew up in a family of Holocaust survivors who never talked about their experiences and who were completely traumatized. So I'm very familiar with what it's like to be around people who are shut down by trauma. I have a lot to say about that. I wanted to get inside the head of someone who's experiencing the trauma while it's being formed. So that is what's happening in this scene. This isn't a dream, it's a vision that one of the GIs is having. Part of a longer scene, of course. I'm going to stay with Victory Parade. And I'm sorry, I apologize that these pages are out of order. I didn't think to number them properly. So I'll go back to the pages that I'm skipping. This is a different character's dream in Victory Parade. And I'm seeing it's showing up a little funky on the screen. I hope you can see the color and the texture. Okay. And another thing that I like to do is crib from New Objectivity paintings and Bauhaus paintings in my work. So if anybody recognizes this painting, that's great. It's Otto Dix's The Scat Players, but I've also thrown in one of his War Widows, kind of snuck her in between the two characters in the middle and on the right. And I have to tell you, it's really fun copying Otto Dix paintings. If you're a painter, I really recommend trying this. It's a blast. You really get into the skin of this painting. Work. So I do also do nonfiction. I want to discuss a tiny bit. A couple of years ago, I went to Buchenwald. I was in Germany visiting Dr. Neidham, pardon me, actually. And I partially chose Buchenwald because I knew it would be an accessible place, but also because there was a lot of source material of veterans talking about liberating that camp, because it was liberated by the US Army. And so there's a lot of English language history of that. In particular, Studs Terkel took a lot of oral histories, but there are others as well. So I had a really funny experience at Buchenwald. Not funny, haha, funny, peculiar. I really wasn't sure what was going to happen when I went there. I wasn't sure what kind of experience I was going to have. My family didn't spend most of the war in concentration camps. Most of them were in hiding in the woods. So that is a very intimate story for me, where the concentration camps are a bit more distant. I did have family in there, and that's a thing I can talk about later, but I have no personal connection to Buchenwald. It's a cultural connection. I had a lot of experiences that day at that place, and I'm only showing you one page of what is a 6 or 7 page comic, but I'm showing it because I wanted to talk about this weird experience I had. I had expected that I would have a traumatizing time. And I really also wanted to not have a body as I was experiencing this place. I didn't want to be hungry. I didn't want to need coffee. I didn't want to feel my nervous system reacting to anything. But instead, when that did inevitably happen, because it takes a long time to get through Buchenwald, especially the museum there, when I finally did get hungry, I felt this surge of power. Like, I am the most strong, powerful person. They couldn't kill me. It was like a genetic rebellion inside me. And as I'm saying here, the words of one of my favorite songs came to me. And I just, this page is quite the pastiche of references. See if you can recognize the Oscar Schlemmer works that I have copied again in this page. I had the most incredible experience of just feeling so alive, incandescent. It was an amazing experience. And then as soon as I got on the train to go back to Berlin, I literally shut off like a switch, like a device recharging, which has never happened to me before. So I think that power surge kind of wiped me out, and I needed a reset. I could go on and on about that experience, the entire experience of being there, but I will just leave you with this one because it was so unexpected. And when I came back to the States and I was telling a friend of mine who's not Jewish this story, he told me about visiting Bergen-Belsen and having a completely different experience, even though he has no cultural connection to the war in any way. So I think that this is some sort of ancestral kind of middle finger to the oppression of the Holocaust. Like, you couldn't kill us. And here I am, and I'm standing on your grave. Here I am. I'm standing in your rubble. Although that feels a bit reductive, but that's close. So also,
Leela, why don't we pause?
Yes.
Why don't we pause here and then return to some of this conversation after Miriam's had an opportunity to present?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have a great track of the time here. So yeah,
no
sorry.
Problem. No, it was a great note to end it on. So I think that's perfect. So Miriam, why don't you take it from here?
What's happening?
You could click on yourself. Try clicking on yourself.
I did.
Hi, Miriam. We can see you fine. So you're welcome to start speaking at whenever you're ready.
Yes. So, good evening. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor. The stories my mother told me about our escape and living in hiding during the year 1944 to 1945 and the fate of our family, they were like a running narrative inside my head throughout my life, sometimes in the third person, a daily, unwanted, uninvited presence. They begged to be told. But I'm not a writer, and besides, I thought, who needs another Holocaust novel? However, when I discovered comics for myself, I embraced the idea that I can draw my story. In June of 1944, the Germans entered Hungary, and there were gradual restrictions in everyday life. Like Jews were not supposed to own pets or electric appliances, or sit in a park bench, or attend any performance. The future was unknown and scary. Now I understand that I can have pictures Okay, number 1, please. Thank you. Many of my stories starts with the beloved city. We loved her and felt part of her until we were told that we don't belong at all because we are Jews, not Hungarian. Finally, we were ordered to leave everything behind and move into the ghetto in Budapest. Number 2, please, picture. My mother did not obey. She purchased fake documents which proved that she was a peasant girl from the country, a servant in the city with an illegitimate child. So she managed to slip us away, board a train, and travel out to the countryside. Here we are in a crack of dawn, walking to the station, and she looks like a peasant woman. We had only a first address, but for the next year, we wandered from place to place until the end of the war. In June of 1945, my father, who had only seen me once since I was born in 1942, returned from the front and found us. Reunited, we moved back to Budapest. Third picture, please. This book, We Are on Our Own, my first graphic novel, is called a memoir, but our names are changed in it. That is because my mother, who approved it, only asked me not to use any of our real names or the places we lived in. As she said, someone might see it, be offended, and come and get us. Trying to tell her that anyone who would recognize us is either dead or too old did not work for her. My publisher was not happy about it because it's supposed to have your own name in a memoir. But as I told him, this is part of the story, the paranoia of someone living through such times. Fourth picture, please. I never expected such interest in my work. And first I resisted to become the Holocaust lady, going from synagogue to synagogue and book clubs and talk. But after a while, and with schools asking to teach the story, I had to take responsibility for what I created. This book is in black and white. At some point, the publisher, Chris Oliveros, asked me, what about color? I told him that I see that world of the past in black and white and gray tones. Perhaps because of the few old photographs we had from the war. And these two, of my father resting and his friends carrying what seems to be the dinner, was always scared me, fascinated me, made me sad, but ultimately it was the style that I worked in, this black and white, strong pencil. So after a while, and having done a few more shorter stories about that period, I thought I was finished with the old world, until one day, my younger son, who worked in Europe, announced to us that he decided to live in Berlin, as in Germany. Now, this was a real shock to my Holocaust-centric existence, and I simply could not deal with it. Adding to this was the great excitement of the unification of Germany, the wall coming down, which filled the world with hope and joy. Me, I was filled with dread. A strong, unified Germany? I knew that I had to work this out, but how? How even to start? I was frozen, sitting at my desk and staring at my desk. Fifth picture, please. We live in New York City, in Washington Heights, highest spot in Manhattan, and I love the view. The Hudson River, the Great Big Bridge, the many, many birds flying around, sunrises, sunsets, the storms. And I thought that if I can just use this love to start with, perhaps I can calm down and get organized. I also started to write down my thoughts, collecting articles, related information, tacking them all on my studio's wall. Maybe I was ready. But when I lifted my pencil, I didn't have the patience to plan a page with panels and gutters and borders. And I just went wading into the paper, working in real time, unplanned, scratching in my pain and dread, this time in color. I love David Ulin's comment from the LA Times. This book. The book is a series of reflections from the trenches of life as it lived. How true. Letting it go. Well, people ask me, so did you? No. I keep hearing catharsis, catharsis. I hate that word. It's sort of a buzzword, and I hate buzzwords. But the truth is, in the past, if someone asked me, you were born in 1942, a Jew in Hungary, how did you survive? I would just choke up and say, not now. I'll tell you some other time. But after the books, now, I can actually talk about the past. Thank you.
Is it my turn? Thank you all for these three great introductory presentations. It is a real pleasure and honor for me to co-moderate tonight's Artists Roundtable. Nora, Leela, and Miriam, our focus tonight will be on your own arts-based research and your approach to visual storytelling and graphic art with respect to Holocaust-themed representations. We're also quite keen to learn more about how you work with or against signature images, symbols, and metaphors that are extensively reproduced in popular culture and media. My colleague Biz and I will take turns asking questions. We would also like to encourage audience members to ask questions via the Q&A function throughout this webinar. We will share as many questions as possible later on with the guest artists. Now, I would like to begin with the following question. There is a very fine line between revealing and concealing in autobiographical narratives. Nora, Leela, and Miriam, can you elaborate on this process, walking us through a panel sequence or collage in your storyboards or thumbnail drawings? Who would like to begin? Maybe, how about Miriam?
Okay, I'm on the far left. So,
yes.
So, okay, so I will ask to project the next picture, which would be number 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Number 6, please. And this would be a rough. Okay. No, then the next one. Yes, that's good. Yes. Okay, so this is a rough of one of the pages in the book. And I don't know if I answer the kind of question that you are asking, but this is where the German officer paid attention to my mother, who was very beautiful and of course hiding as a servant. And he came to this place where they were selling wine, And my mother didn't have any choice but giving herself to this man. And what seems to be to this child, me at the time, I guess, she was crying after him, that he left. And so this is what I think, what seems to be, and it is not really. And if you can do the next slide, please. That's the next page. And he's the officer who was in a nearby town, I guess responsible in the whole region, higher rank. And his wife was there. So his wife traced his steps and showed up at the farmhouse where we stayed. And of course, she suspected that perhaps that my mother would be, because she had dark skin, would be a gypsy or a Jew. Ultimately, if you read my book, she confronted this man, the officer, and he beat her half to death, telling her that if she reveals anything about my mother, he will simply kill her. So, strangely enough, because he truly loved my mother. Okay, that's all I can say about.
Thank you so much, Miriam. How about Nora? Can you walk us through a panel sequence or a collage where you negotiate this very fine line between concealing and revealing?
And sorry, have you been hearing me the whole time?
No.
Sorry.
Only now.
Okay, so I'm going to start again. I think it's a very important question because when you write a memoir, as you say, you have to be honest. I think there's no point in writing a memoir if you're not being honest about your feeling and the narrative you're telling, but you also have to be respectful, and it's a matter of negotiation in a way. In my particular case, because there has been, that I from the beginning that I started researching the project. Sorry, I think there's a feedback from somebody. I don't know if you can all hear it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, because I was often confronted with this question, do I have the right to tell a story about the war from a German perspective? And my biggest fear from the beginning was that my attempt of telling the story would be misinterpreted as me trying to victimize Germans or creating a sense of sentimentality, false sentimentality. And so there was this moment in the book at the very end where I tried to find a man who was the son of a German Christian man who was married to a Jewish woman in my hometown, who his wife had been deported to Theresienstadt, but she was liberated and returned to my hometown, after which the two of them emigrated to America. And this man, as I found out through archival material I found at my hometown's archive, was a friend of my grandfather's. And I tried to find out if he was still alive somewhere in the place where he emigrated to. I was able to find out that he emigrated to New York, that he had settled in New Jersey, but then I saw that he and his wife had died. And then I continued with my research and saw that they had a son. And I was able, through the internet, to find his son's address. And I wrote him a letter and finally was able to call him. And it was in a way an attempt of trying to find my grandfather, trying to find out what my grandfather's, moral position was under the Nazi regime. And I thought for a long time about how I could illustrate this conversation I had with this old man in Florida. He had moved to Florida in his retirement, and we had an hour-long conversation about his own childhood in Germany, in my hometown during the war. And it was such a sensitive moment, because here I spoke to this man who I didn't know, what he was thinking about my finding him and kind of tracking him down, to use a kind of negative term, and calling him up. And it was a very awkward moment for me to call him up and say, I'm the granddaughter of a guy who was a Nazi party member, and your father was a friend of his. Can we talk about this? Because I didn't know what his, perspective would be on my country, on my country's history, and on me as a stranger calling him up. But the conversation ended up being so gentle and generous on his part, that I was really touched. And I chose to use images of Florida to underline this conversation that was very much in the wartime years in my hometown. So while I wrote about my hometown in the war and his childhood, I chose to illustrate this moment with images from Florida, because I think I felt like I needed to create this artificial distance in order to get closer to him, or to make the conversation stand out in a way. And I tried to choose images that conveyed the gentleness of the sound of his voice, but also of his, kind of his spirit, the generosity with which he shared his story.
Thank you so much, Nora. And Leela and Miriam, please feel free to respond as well. Leela, do you want to walk us through a panel sequence as well?
Yeah, sure. And I hope I can address your question about concealing how we choose what to show. I think if I'm hearing you right, you're asking a little bit about that. I'm very careful in how I show other people, or at least I try to be. And I think because I come from a sort of post-underground tradition in comics, that's been a little bit of a challenge for me, because that's a very, the era in which I came of age was an era of making confrontational art. And in comics especially, that's a real important part of it. So kind of getting to the point where I gave myself some sensitivity training in depicting people, that is a balancing act. So I think what I'm going to show you is, I'm going to show you a couple of pages from a piece in progress. I recently went to Poland, to my grandfather's town, and it was a thing I thought I would never do. Can you see this art properly? Yeah, okay, good. So I'll try to be as brief about this as possible. There's a group of people in Poland who restore Jewish cemeteries and do educational work in schools and all over the country, and try to reconnect with the Jewish descendants of the towns that they're working in, that they're from. So some of this is kind of a grassroots thing. Like the guy in my grandfather's town is this young guy who's just kind of become this informal archivist of this tiny little town in Galicia. The big sort of organizational arm of it is a whole other group of people, and they sort of came together. So I went to Grybów, this little town in the foothills of the Carpathians, I guess, to be at the ceremony of the unveiling of this this memorial in the cemetery. And it was another one of those experiences, kind of like going to Buchenwald, where I had no idea what was going to happen, and I was worried about all of this dark stuff. And what actually happened was I completely fell in love with the place. So here I'm sort of, I'm fictionalizing this depiction somewhat. I don't have any trouble choosing how to depict myself. I guess I kind of make myself look a little more goth and a little more tired than I really am. There's also a page where I'm talking about an incident that happened afterwards, where I put a black box over somebody's face because what she said to me made me very angry. And I haven't quite worked out how I'm going to talk about it in this piece, but I know how I'm going to show it visually. I don't want anyone to know who this person is. So there will be no identifying details. This is kind of an obvious trick. And then I have this kind of speculative conversation, the only moment of levity in this piece, where the three graveyard memorial lanterns are talking like a bunch of Yiddish grandmothers, envisioning my own grandmother, who I don't think she ever would have said that I look like a goy, but she certainly would have had some choice words in other ways. So I wasn't so much thinking of what to conceal here as just what to highlight. Some of that comes very organically. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Yes, thank you so much. And Biss will take over. And some of the questions that are being raised right now, I think will very much tie to the next question.
Yes, thank you for that. So Nora and Leela, you've already spoken to this just a little bit, but I wanted to push it a bit further. One of the things that really strikes me about all of your work and graphic memoir on the Holocaust in general is the amount of research that goes into it, be it in personal or public archives. What role did primary sources and archival documents play in the making of your graphic novels? And what was your particular research approach?
I would love to to answer this if that's okay. I was trained as an illustrator, and an illustrator is a researcher as much as a drawer. So it's second nature. But when I was working on Untersachsen, I spent so much time at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum that the docents started to recognize me. They wouldn't let me draw in the museum, but I took a lot of reference photos. So I create my own archival research. I've learned the value of taking bad photos, by which I mean just untechnical reference photographs of things that I need that maybe nobody else would notice, like a crumbling cornice on a tenement building, right? The way a fire escape is bent. But I also do a lot of what I call sideways research. So some of that is in the form of fiction, novels and film, but also, and paintings from the time period, but also just trying to get a feel for the time period. I read around my topic quite a bit. It kind of like creating a scaffolding for a building. And then when you take the scaffolding away, you have a building. You wouldn't have had it without the scaffolding. So for this book that I'm working on now, I'm reading a lot of books about World War II. Most of that stuff won't end up in the book, but hopefully it will be in its DNA or in its scaffolding. And then there's visual research, which is a whole nother area that I think all three of us do constantly.
Thank you. Miriam or Nora, would you like to speak to this?
Miriam, do you want to go first? Okay. I was just lip reading your, yeah, research is an important part of my work too. And it's also for me the most fun part. I spent about 6 years working on my book Belonging, and the first 2 years were spent entirely on research. And for me as well, it took on a lot of different forms. There is the archival research, which I really enjoy because you can really delve into other times, other people's thinking. I mean, even looking at my hometown's phone books, original phone books from 1933 and 1938, for instance, was such an exciting experience, just seeing these names of people who were, you know, my grandfather's friends, or also very, very tragically and poignantly seeing the Jewish names disappear, you know, from the phone books over the years. And you know, this is all just text. It's just letters in an old book, but it means so much. You know, there are these lives captured in these lines. And then field research, I don't know if that's even still the proper academic term nowadays, but I love going to the places where things happened. Like Leela commented earlier, I think it's a very powerful thing to immerse yourself physically in a space where history happened. And I don't only mean memorials and museum sites, but also, you know, streets, regular streets, also talking to people who knew my family in the example of my book, trying to meet the actual people who still are alive, who remember my uncle who died at age 19. But I also personally, to me, the act of drawing, I came to realize itself is a form of research, because it forces you to imagine and to look, to witness. It's an act of witnessing, and to make visible what you witness in a way. I mean, it's secondhand witnessing, but so I really found that, to me, drawing itself is a form of research, even though it's part of the actual execution or practice of the piece, of the actual book. But somehow it all connects to me on the level of drawing.
That's fantastic. And I really love how you identify drawing as a form of witness. It's really powerful. And that resonates with a lot of nonfiction comics and the work of Hilary Shute in particular. Miriam, would you like to speak to this question about research and archival documents in your own work? I think you'll have to turn on your microphone though.
Unmute. Is that it? Am I on?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
So I like to have a drawing, page 8, please, if you could screen that now. So first of all, okay, this is both of my books, of course, are just very personal, and research-wise, my mother told me a few things throughout the years until like my age 30, when she told me everything. And but when I started to do the book, and I did the book, and I only showed it to her when she didn't know I was doing it. I showed it to her when Drone and Quarterly, my publisher, approved the roughs. And so I sort of put together the story entirely from what she told me here and there. And the other thing I had to do is create myself as a little girl. I only have sons to begin with. And I had to create myself as the little girl that I was. And what helped me a great deal was these few letters and postcards that my mother sent. This is a collage of them. My mother sent to the front to my father, up to the point when we had to vacate and escape. Then for the next year, we didn't know about each other. But this went to the army, to the front, and a letter and postcards. This red mark there, you can see this was the military, checking the contents and all that. So that was what revealed to me. She described me, how I was at the time, what I was saying. And the rest of the things, the landscapes, the building I was born in, I still had a picture of that in Budapest. But I mainly just looked at the many books that I have from Hungary about this villages and towns and everything. So I put them together from that. But what I had to do very carefully and spent a lot of time with, and fortunately now everything is online, so I didn't have to spend hours and hours in the library like I used to. And you can find everything. For example, you see, this is a page that I have Nazi uniforms, German uniforms, and I'm very proud of the lower part where I found this really nasty magazine, military magazine of the army, German army. And that was, so And I had to really carefully research all weapons, Russian, Hungarian, and German, and airplanes for allies and everything. Anything that came up, I had, because people who read these books, they are very critical. And if you make a mistake, like, oh no, the Russian tanks didn't have that many rollers, that, they didn't use this, didn't use that, they will blog it, they will be really nasty about it. So, and I went through something like that in a short story. So I was very careful to make sure that everything that I had in there was totally correct. So, but like you both say, researching is just so much fun, it's really great.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful. Very helpful in understanding the process behind the production of these graphic novels. It's one of my favorite things to learn when talking to the artists behind these books. But I'm going to pass it over to Charlotte for the next question.
Thanks, Biz. Now, Nora, you talk about in one of your interviews about the collage, like fragmentary nature of memory. Now, this is a strong feature in all of your artworks. Can you reflect on how you convey this fragmentation as a visual style? Or perhaps, how do you thematize memory in your representation? Again, please feel free to discuss a specific drawing or sequence of illustrations in your work. Leela, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. Talk about memory, if I understand your question correctly.
Memory and how you represent it in your visual style.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to show examples of that because I didn't pull them onto this device, because some of that work isn't about this particular subject matter. But when I work with personal memory of my own, it's a non-linear process. So I'm working with what comes to the surface in a state of drawing as an excavation. So that's in the sketching process. And that's in my body. So sometimes I have to get up and move around my studio. I went through a period of putting on music and jumping up and down to it, which I don't do anymore because now I live in an apartment and not a house. But usually it comes through, it comes from images that don't feel linear. And I'm really happy that I'm able to digest them and translate them into my work. It also takes a certain amount of time to digest an experience. There's something Miriam said. Miriam, when you talked about how creating, being able to talk about the past made you, I'm sorry, I'm going to paraphrase you so poorly, but when you talked about how you were able to talk about it finally, how it released something for you, it made me think about how this work can be a form of exposure therapy for trauma. I had a similar experience making a story about a very big loss in my life. And that is where I learned how to kind of work, I already knew, but where I felt like I really got how to work with fragmentary memories in a visual way. I hope that answers your question. There's a lot of sketching that goes into it first.
Yeah, it greatly answers it, Leela. And I actually wanted to respond to one of our Q&A questions. We wanted to raise them early, but it's very fitting. And it's by Caitlin Burritt, one of our former students. And she says, as artists, how does your artistic process help you to interpret your research? Which portion comes first in your process? Or do you do both in your work? And I think to some extent that very much ties in with what you just said as well.
Certainly, it's a mess. It's a
mess.
It's a mess. And Miriam, do you would like to respond to this mess?
Yes. Well, people ask how you work, for example, whether you write first or you draw first, to draw first. And in my case, as I'm thinking, I'm drawing and writing at the same time. That's how I work it out. And there is a number 10 about memory. If you can, I can have the number 10 illustration, please. Yeah, but well, that's okay. That's before. The next one, if it's possible. Thank you. So all the memory. Now, it is clear probably to most everybody that I don't really remember these things that happened because I was too small. But there's two memories that I have that I think I have is, for example, my mother's holding me in some kind of a near the ceiling and in some place, and this person is handing me poppy seed strudel. I remember it so clearly. And then I remember a little white dog. And then I remember the bombing, like the noise. So that's but you have to work around it. And if you go back to the illustration before this one, I'm sorry that I made, yes. And very strong in my mind. My mother told me this story, how we had to run for our lives from the Russian soldiers, and that she had to put me in, I was getting heavy in the snow, and she put me into a suitcase and she pulled me. And that, throughout my life, that image was so strong and so tragic and so driving that I really believe that I created the whole book because of that one image that carried on with me, that my mother was pulling me in a suitcase on the snow. Okay.
Thank you, Miriam. And now, Nora, you mentioned before that the work of a memory archivist, how does that relate to your own work in thematizing, reconstructing memory in your visual art, in your graphic art? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think drawing is always an act of documenting your perception of the world around you, basically, and by doing that, shedding light on it, for others to see. And by doing that, you're always, in a way, acting in the role of a witness or an archivist, because you're trying to distill something on the page that lasts longer than you, hopefully, presumably. Talking again about this idea of memory. I mentioned it yesterday, so hopefully it's not too much of a repetition, but that I thought a lot about the term history while working on the book, and realized that I think it's important to not only perceive history as something the way we learned about it in school, because that history was obviously written, and it's always, who writes history? I mean, it's been written about so much from an academic point of view, but also history is also an accumulation of personally experienced moments in time, and moments that blur over time or become reconstructed in one's head in retrospect to make sense for whatever we perceive our life to be at a given time. And so there is no linear course, and it is a fragmentary thing, but that doesn't mean that it's not logical. We assign a certain logic to it, and I tried to, sorry, I have to share my screen. I tried to convey that in my way of working by using this, different forms. And I think, to me, what was also really important was to admit to the fact that it's fragmentary, to admit to the fact that our perspective will always be subjective. And of course, we have to admit to the fact that they're historic facts. I'm not saying that they're alternative facts, not at all. They're, facts that are clearly facts and can't be debated. But I think we all have personal relationships to these facts and perceptions of them and what they make sense, how they make sense in our lives. And I think as a writer and as an illustrator, we have to admit to that fact in a way openly, that what we do is subjective. But that doesn't mean it's not, meaningful, or that it's less meaningful than a straightforward documentary film on the subject. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, it did. And particularly the three elements that all of you raised: drawing as excavation, drawing as documentation, but also as bearing witness. And I think all of these elements are very deeply intertwined in all of your work. Thank you. So, but back to Biz.
Yeah, and to build on that, since we're seeing so many of these connections within your work and as well as within your process, we wanted to give you all an opportunity to pose questions to each other before we opened up to the audience. And I can already see some of these things emerging in the chat between the panelists. Do you have anything that you'd like to ask each other about your work or about your experience?
Of course, well, Nora, I bought your book, of course, and read it like in 2 days, like without doing anything else but reading it. And it's very, very, very touching, because throughout my life, even if I heard a German accent, that was, I have a very difficult time with that. And right now, my best friend is somebody who was born in Kassel, and so I had to get over this thing. And reading your book, I was crying once in a while, because there was very much sadness and love, a whole lot of love. And also, what I always do somehow when I read books like this, that I'm matching the dates. See, this is very funny, interesting. I'm reading your book and I'm matching the dates, that 1942, 45, 43, 45. Where was I when your grandfather or your parents, what was going on? We had to then leave Budapest and this, and there's constant thinking about it. And the little photographs, when Edwin and Elsa, they correspond, and he's thanking her for the little photographs. And my father received these little photographs that my mother had to burn everything, but my father was in the army and they knew he was Jewish, so he didn't have to burn everything. So we have whatever he received, the little, with the edges, the photographs. And also the letter from German young soldiers to their mother, and the love, same love, and the same loss. And this was the kind of thing that I felt throughout your book, such as also when I walk around in Berlin. We go every year, we go to visit my son. And I look at, and I see young men, German men, and I think about them, look at their gentle face, nice and everything. And I try to kind of put them into that uniform, the sadness and the tragedy of young people going to die in that time. So these are all the things that come up when I read your book.
Thank you so much. I'm very touched by what you said about the book and your experience reading it. And I loved your books. I read them too. And I think it's really books, and especially illustrated books, that can have that power of providing this other perspective to you. And when I read your book, Letting Go, I feel like I hope that Germans, I'm curious about, has it been published in Germany or?
No, this book only was published in French.
Okay.
It didn't make the impact of the first book, which is like 7 languages, 6, including Polish and Korean, which is
okay.
No, so Yes.
Because again, sometimes I'm asked, by people in Germany who are living a German reality, and a reality where they feel that, Germany has confronted its past in a very thorough way. I'm sometimes asked, why do you feel uncomfortable when you speak German on the subway on your phone, sitting next to a man with wearing a yarmulke, for instance? And to me, it's so obvious, because my grandparents' generation was responsible for the death of their grandparents' generation. How could that not be awkward? And I think if you don't leave your familiar cultural perspective, you don't feel that. And I think that's what books can do. And I hope, I wonder what your book would do to German readers in that regard. Because I think when you don't have that personal insight provided by an author or illustrator, you can develop a very quick sense of defensiveness, on both sides. And I think these books, they're able to provide a certain openness. I wanted to ask you, Miriam, about, and maybe I missed this earlier, but how old were you exactly when your mother and you were fleeing in hiding? And
I was 2 years old.
Okay. And so you, did you, when you were illustrating those scenes, did you rely mostly on your family's memories or narratives on that time, or?
Nobody. Only the stories my mother told me.
Okay.
That's what, and I didn't consult anybody at all. They all were in different situations anyway. And I didn't look for anything but, the books that from Hungary, and then the weapons and this sort of thing. That's the only research I did. All the rest is just like my imagination.
Ah, okay.
When I seated my mother down to pour us both a little scotch and showed her the roughs of the book, and she read it and she cried a little, and I said to myself, if she won't approve, I'm gonna have to divorce her, because I had to do that book,
That's what writing a memoir is like, about.
But she turned around and hugged me and she said, you did something very beautiful here. And boy, I was relieved, Yeah, but that's what, I didn't consult anybody or any other research or history or anything like that. It was just whatever.
Okay. Leela, I think you had something you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I want to bring up something I've been noticing in our work and also out in the world in general, and I'd be really curious to hear everybody else's perspective on this. I think there's an emerging third generation body of work and perspectives on the Holocaust that I'm really interested in. I think it's still developing, of course, and I'm really intrigued by it. So I think, Nora, that you and I are both examples of that we're finding a way to carry this weight that we've carried all of our lives and to put it into our work. I felt that also when I went to Poland last year, that the people there are doing that in a way that isn't done through art, it's done through actions. And I'm having trouble forming this as a question, so it's more of an observation and an opening to discuss it. And Miriam, I'm curious how you see the next generation of how people like us talk about the war and the personal experiences of it. Those of us who were not there and who are trying to address the wound now.
Yeah, well, this is very interesting because it comes to my mind when I see, I was very hard-nosed about this all the time. When I saw artwork or anything that was done by anybody who was not there, who did not experience it, I felt like it was like, come on, give me a break here, okay? You're having a great time. And I accused the Americans of loving these movies of suffering and Holocaust, and adore the war movies. And my husband always angry about that because he's American. I said, no, you guys love it, And that's what, when I'm looking at my husband is studying German, but you know, for my book, my second book, he's studying German. But anyway, so yeah, I was very doubtful about it, but now you're sort of describing this act of doing so that the next generation tries to deal with it. And I would say to myself, come on, leave it alone. Let's move on. Let's leave it behind. You know, it wasn't your problem. Have a good time, have a good life. Unfortunately, it's not working that way. And I had to recognize that we are in great danger. And I had to realize that now when they invite me to places to go and talk, I sure do. I go to schools, I go anywhere they ask me to talk about it because I can, and they listen to me. So I'm no longer so harsh about the next generation creating work about the Holocaust that were not in there, you know.
That's really fascinating to me, Miriam. I'm so happy to hear this perspective because it's so, I've never heard anyone say that before. I'm so fascinated by it. I want to say also, not only is it relevant to what's happening now and always has been, but so there is that. Like for me, what I'm doing right now is my form of anti-fascist activism, and it's very much about now. But also we carry it in our genes, we carry it in our DNA. It doesn't just go away. You know, when I went to Poland, I had this profound experience of, from the minute I got off the plane, feeling the sense of multi-directional generational trauma in the airport parking lot. It stayed with me for the entire trip. It was in the environment, it was in the air, but also there was a sense of connection, like, oh, now I understand myself. This is my place. So I think there's something there that draws us back. I understand the response that some have. I hear this from people who have no connection to it, no familial or historical connection to it. Stop talking about it. Jews need to stop talking about the Holocaust, which that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, that's another conversation.
But it is urgent to connect it to now. And Nora, I'm sorry, I want to hear your answer to this third generation thing.
No, I've talked a lot. No, I think what you're both saying is true, is that, I mean, I think we don't think often enough about, or deeply enough about the fact that we are made of the past. You know, we don't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it's so easy to just focus on the now and forget that, I mean, especially in Germany, the way our society is structured today is a direct outcome of the terrible atrocities committed. You know, it's trying to be exactly the opposite of what was before. And every country is like that. Every country today is the way it is because of what was before. So as you say, it's in our DNA, even though as a German, I don't like that, you know, I don't like to feel like Nazism is in my DNA. And it's also something that the Nazis played with, you know, on the opposite side. So I have always a problem calling it DNA, but you know, we are made of it, culturally, historically, and all that. And we have to continue to face it, and we have to continue to explore it, and in new ways, through new generations, through new technologies. We owe it to the people who experienced this and suffered through it or died you know, under it. And we have to continue to find ways of telling their stories. And of course, they have to be well researched. I mean, I fully agree with Miriam that often it's just either the illustrations or the way the narrative is constructed. I mean, of course, you see it a lot in Hollywood. It's unfortunately the gray zone is often missing. And then we end up with such a simplified idea of what the war was like. And that's actually harmful. I think that's harmful because it doesn't prepare us for situations such as the one we're living through now, where again, we're confronted with a sort of dictator, and we need to understand how people like that can be, you know, how they rise to the top and what we can do. And we can only understand that if we understand why people, for instance, who voted for Adolf Hitler did that, and we can only understand that if we also look at the German perspective, for instance, and the nuances to that perspective. And in terms of the third generation, it's also something I'm very interested in, because I think there is actually some overlap. And I briefly mentioned this yesterday at the conversation, that I once got an email from a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors who said to me that the last sentence in my book really resonated with her, which was, who would we be as a family today if the war had never happened? Wow. And I think that applies to all of us. And I think it's in a way a central question to this trauma, this war trauma that continues to evolve through generations. And what I heard in Germany is that the third generation, so the difference between the second generation and third generation in writing about the Holocaust is that the second generation, so the one of my parents, were really accusing their parents, and the focus was much more on their parents' lives. Whereas now with the third generation, the focus is much more on the authors themselves and what do I do now with this heritage? How do I apply it to the present? So it's not so much accusatory only anymore, but more about what do I do with this now, today?
I think that's great. Yeah.
So that would be a very useful thing and very nice thing to come up with.
And if I may say, go ahead, Leela. I'm just one eye on the time, and we need to we have a segue to the audience questions, and I think it works very well. Somebody's asking, now I have a question. In an era when American racism appears to be increasingly exponentially and Holocaust denial increases as those who have experienced in age, how does the graphic novel play a role in bearing witness? You responded to that already, but I think we could say a little bit more about that.
What I was about to say, actually, I think is somewhat related to that, although I'm not sure it addresses how the graphic novel deals with it. But I want to say, as an American, talking about all of these things, talking about how Germany confronts its past, talking about how we're made of the past, the turmoil we're experiencing right now is coming partially because we do not face our past and we do not admit it. So we are a country of constant, violent, undigested, repeated trauma. All of the systemic racism and destruction in this country it's going to kill us if we don't face it. So I'm very impressed by the way that Germany has confronted its past. I would like us to do the same. And when you suggest, there are people in this country who, when you suggest even the smallest bit of approaching it with honesty, you get a really violent response. So this is something that's been on my mind a lot lately, and it's going to burn us down if we don't face it. How the graphic novel addresses it, I think there are some really amazing cartoonists right now working with topics that are more not about the Holocaust, not about Jews, that are addressing indigenous genocide and the legacy of enslaving human beings in this country. I can't give examples right now, but maybe other people here can. I'm suffering from the terrible curse of the mid-career artist, which is I don't have time to read a lot of the comics that come out now because I'm too busy.
Oh, I never feel so guilty about anything. Gee,
We're Jews. We're guilty. We feel guilty.
Our life there, I mean, have a martini. I don't know. So that's what I do. Anyway, so what I'm impressed about is in Germany, and maybe Nora, you actually had that in your schooling. No, probably it's more recent. That they published for 10th graders. I think in German schools, they have this wonderful graphic novel that is dealing with, it's in the style of Tintin, which is very beautiful and very clean. And I forgot the title, but it's about two families, and the families whose ancestors were through the war, and then the same families, the present time. and they have this conversation of what would you have done, you know, to the children in the school. What would you have done in this situation over there? And then a conversation with the present people. And it is so marvelous. It's a great book. I mean, great. I saw it in the New York Times. It was with a big article about it. And when I go and talk in places, I always bring it with me to show what they do in Germany, how they teach the subject with a graphic novel. Nothing better than that.
That sounds amazing. I think the open question lately in America, the statement actually has been, if you've ever asked yourself what you would do, you're doing it now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have a deeper indictment of my own country right now, but also perhaps a more nuanced understanding of everyone who lived under Nazi rule, whether they were Germans or Poles or anyone else. It is difficult, it is complicated, and one has to live one's life and take care of one's family. What you do on the day-to-day when the country looks like it's kind of functioning normally is precarious morally.
But we also have to recognize that we actually do have choices. I mean, it's interesting when you go to the park now and you look around and everybody's just walking around with their dogs. And, you know, I often think about that Germany in the 30s and 40s was like that too, that there were these moments of normalcy, you know, and because life goes on in many different ways. But we also have to realize that we have choices, and we make choices, actually, even if we're not consciously aware of it. We make choices on a daily basis that have consequences for other people in this world, you know, politically, but also environmentally. This relates not only to, you know, the resurging of right-wing activity, but also, you know, environmental decisions, food decisions, you know, where does the meat come from that we eat? We make these choices every day, and we are usually not even aware that we make them, and that they have consequences for other people in this world who make the cheap T-shirts we buy, or and so I think we need to, yeah, I mean, how do you get people aware of these things? I mean, obviously it does start early on, so education is a key component, bringing in things like the book, Miriam, I don't know it, but it sounds like a very interesting approach to teaching. But also, as you, Leela, said, making students aware that the real question is not what would I have done, but what am I doing now? Yeah. What are the choices I'm doing? You know, what am I doing knowing that there are children isolated from their parents right now at the border to Mexico? You know, I think we are we're witnessing, actually, at the moment, we don't even realize that we witness terrible times. And yeah, I mean,
we all do, actually. We all do. We realize, like you say, you're saying it because we know it, we realize it. And there's a lot of struggle trying to help this out.
I think times like this often have a way of, they can teach you about the limits of choices and power as well. And unfortunately, in the system we live in, so many choices are made for us. In a capitalist system, sometimes the choices that are presented to you have to do with where you put your money. So, for example, one very small thing that you can do about children in cages is to boycott Amazon, because they collaborate with ICE on facial recognition technology that is used to target immigrants and capture them. This is very similar to the way that the Nazi regime worked with IBM. There's a whole book about it called IBM and the Holocaust. It was a very targeted and specific collaboration, but it enrages me that our choices often come down to things like this, that the world is structured in such a way as to make not doing anything very convenient, make participating unknowingly very convenient, so convenient that it's unavoidable.
Just to interject here for a moment, I don't want to disrupt the really rich conversation that's happening, but I also want to be mindful of time and say that 2 members of the audience have identified the book that you were talking about, Miriam, as Eric Heuvel's The Search. So if
Yes.
that helps fill in some gaps there.
The
The Search, yes, which has been translated into a number of languages and was created in collaboration with the Anne Frank House.
In Hungarian. Yeah.
Yeah. So for a final question to sort of conclude and bring this back to the text that we were talking about today, and perhaps the reception in the various countries in which they've been published. So I think this also does tie to some of the politics that you're talking about. I wanted to return to the titles of your various texts and also the cover art, because the titles and the cover art say so much about the audience in which these publications are being released. And so in particular, we had one audience member ask why Belonging was titled Belonging in North America and Heimat Everywhere Elsewhere. And then I was hoping that Miriam, Leela, you could also speak to the titles of some of your works as well as perhaps the cover art.
My first book, We Are on Our Own, I didn't choose the cover. I didn't design it. I didn't choose the cover, and I hate the title. It's like we are on our own. I mean, it's so long and so cumbersome. But it was my first book, and I was very humbled. Let them do what they wanted. But the second book, I was really stronger, and I decided I am going to make up the title. It's going to be short, letting it go. And then, as I said, the horror of Germany unified, it was a fabulous Bloomberg, I think, cover at the time. See that? That is very strong. It's the colors of German flag. And I thought that was the best way of conveying my message, letting it go, but then still I have this German flag, the colors of the German flag in that book cover.
Thank you, Miriam. That's fantastic. I didn't even notice that in your cover art, so thank you for sharing. Nora, would you like to speak to titles and cover art?
Yes, let me share my screen one last time. So this is the German cover. Oh, sorry, the American cover, and the title was called Belonging: A German Reckons with History and Home. And originally, my American publisher liked the title Heimat, which had always been the work title. Heimat in German basically means the place that you most identify with culturally and emotionally, the place that first formed your worldview. And to me, there has always been a question mark behind that term. So the German title is Heimat, ein deutsches Familienalbum, a German family album. And that is also the title for all the foreign editions, except the Korean, where it's called I Am a German, because there's a famous supermarket chain in Korea called Heimat. And they didn't want to, get people to get the wrong idea. And so initially, America wanted to call the book, my American publisher wanted to call it Heimat, but then I think it was partly a marketing decision that it's a difficult word to retain. And we also wondered if some potential buyers might have negative associations with the term because it was misappropriated by the Nazis. So we tried to look for a term that conveyed the idea of Heimat and the place you feel most connected to. And I thought belonging works because homeland has, these homeland security associations and heartland it just didn't hit the right tone. And in Germany, they initially did not want to call it Heimat because the term has been eyed so critically by Germans because the Nazis misappropriated. It's a very uncomfortable term for a lot of Germans. And so my German publisher was completely against it at the beginning. And then right before the book came out, that completely flipped because of the resurgence of, extreme right-wing political development in Germany that used the term and felt entitled to use the term for their own ideology. And then my publisher and I said, wait a minute, we have the right to use it too. It's not just those who who say enough is enough. You know, we've looked at the past enough and we need to move on, but it's also those Germans who feel like we have to continue to look at the past and yet embrace our cultural heritage. We can also use this term Heimat. And so it was almost in defiance to this extreme right-wing development that we decided in Germany to call it Heimat. And then Heimat caught on in the other editions with various subtitles.
It's great. And I especially love that you are using the painting of David, what's his name?
Caspar David Friedrich.
Caspar David, yeah, I love that.
So, yeah, thank you.
It's a good one.
Leela, would you like to have the final word on titles and cover art before we close this evening's fantastic roundtable?
Yeah, sure. So I titled the book Untersachen because this, no, I think you're asking about that book specifically, right? I can also talk about Victory Parade, but I titled the past book Untersachen because I wanted a title that referred to underclothing, but didn't actually directly mean underwear. So I had a Yiddish consultant on the book, but she's an American who grew up Jewish in a family that I think spoke Yiddish at home, but her Yiddish is mostly academic. So she gave me a series of words that sort of relate to underclothing. And Untersachen really jumped out at me because it's got a heaviness to it. So Liz knows this story of my greatest terror when I was doing events around Untersachen was older Yiddish speakers. So like I did an event at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum where when I came out to talk, it was like right when the book came out, there was a phalanx of great aunts and great uncles in the front row staring at me, waiting. And the same thing kind of happened at a bunch of other events. So at Miami Book Fair, this lady came up to me. She looked exactly like one of my great aunts. She had the bouffant and the coral manicure and the coral jewelry and everything. And she goes, I grew up speaking Yiddish and I've never heard this void. And I was like, oh God. But I'm very dogmatic about book cover design, or I should say I feel strongly about it. So I'm going to try sharing my screen real quick, just so people can see what the cover looks like.
It's great. Really great cover.
And it's going to take me a second. I'll go back there. I don't know if you guys can see this. Can you see the cover of the book?
Yes,
Okay.
I can.
So I'll come back to Zoom, and now I'm going to stop sharing. That book cover design was directly influenced by a handmade, I think, single edition art book by Kirchner that I saw at MoMA in a show in 2011 that was mostly expressionist and new objectivity prints and books. And it just, that era of art really is kind of my home in a lot of ways visually. I believe a book cover, anyone who's taken my illustration class knows this, a book cover has to hit you immediately. It has to give you a lot of information all at once. And then later you can go in and look more deeply into it. But that's what I was trying to do with that cover. And then for the current book, for Victory Parade, it's a little cynical because no one's happy in this book. And I don't think anyone really ends well in this book I'm making. So there's kind of a darkness to it. You know, there was I kept thinking about the celebrations at the end of the war. We all know about, we've all seen all that footage, but how traumatized people were while they were celebrating. And I think about my grandparents coming out of the forest in Poland when my grandmother was pregnant with my aunt in hiding in the woods in a hole in the ground, and how liberation is not necessarily celebration. It's something else. It's much more complicated. So that's the origin of that title. And I don't have a cover design for that yet.
Thank you so much. We could have gone on now for another hour without problems, but with an eye on our time, we have to close it now. And our apologies also to the audience members whose questions we could and cannot share with Nora, Leela, and Miriam tonight. So I would like to sincerely thank our three extraordinary guest artists, Nora Krug, Leela, Corman, and Miriam, Katin, for a thought-provoking Artists Roundtable. It was a great honor and privilege for both Biz and I to co-moderate this event. I also would like to sincerely thank our audience members for their thoughtful questions. I will now hand off to Deputy Consul General Birgit Densch for her closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Biz. And it's really not an easy task you give me to find the final words for today's amazing event. Thank you, Nora, Leela, and Miriam, for sharing your personal opinions and truly intimate insights with us tonight. As Charlotte said, also thank you very much to all members of our audience for your questions and your very active participation. I'm sorry to say that today was the last public event in our event series with Nora Krug. As I said before, the conversation started, the recordings of yesterday's conversation of Nora Krug with Marsha Lederman, and today's event will be made available through the website of the German missions in Canada, www.sogerman.ca. You will find the website again mentioned in the follow-up email you will receive after this event. Yeah, and so it remains to express my sincere thanks to our partners who all contributed to this true co-production. Nina Krieger from the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center in Vancouver, Charlotte Charrier and Matthew Pollard at UVic, and Biz Neidem, Uma Kuma, and Florian Gastner at UBC. Some of you I hope to see again tomorrow evening when our third and last event with Nora starts, but which will be not open for the public because it will be really reserved for a conversation of Nora Krug with students of mainly UBC and UVic on her book. Thank you, Nora Krug, Leela Corman, Miriam, Katin, for your commitment, for your work and your precious art. Thank you, Biz and Charlotte, for tonight. Thank you, Florian, for the great technical support. Nobody sees you, but we are all profiting from you. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. This was fantastic.
It was a real honor. Thank you so much.
It was an honor to have you all.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.